I'm joined today by Dr. Hedi Viterbo to discuss his book, Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel, Palestine. So thank you, Dr. Viterbo, for joining us for this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So perhaps I could just start by asking you, this is a very interesting read, and I see from the book that it was a long time in the making, this research. You've been conducting this research for a while. And I wondered if you could just say something about the motivation behind conducting the research and then producing the book at the end of it.
Well, thanks again for the invitation to do this interview. I guess because of the nature of this project and how long it took, my motivations evolved over time. Looking back from where I am now, I would say that the book as a project had several motivations along the way. Maybe I'll mention some key ones. I think one was to try to, the title is Problematizing. So it's a lot about challenging some conventional wisdom. I think one of the key things that motivated me from the get-go was trying to problematize childhood as a human rights and a legal category. And that's something that I also kind of provide the theoretical framework for in the introductory book, in an attempt to kind of introduce readers to that debate, because I felt like, and I say that, I felt like we as socio-legal scholars, as legal scholars more broadly, we've come to increasingly problematize, challenge, and question other identity categories, such as gender, sexuality, disability, race. But childhood, even though there's a huge body of scholarship, obviously, on children, childhood as a category is something that we still take for granted. And what I was trying to do in this project was really to draw on and contribute to a growing body of research that, first of all, challenges the assumption that adulthood and childhood are just pre-given universal natural categories for the law and for human rights to simply address and regulate, and try to reverse that equation and think about childhood and adulthood as something that is a legal construct to a large extent, and then look at what that actually means in a particular socio-political context, and how in the process of the law manufacturing childhood, reinforcing childhood, negotiating it, what that does, including the way in which childhood can operate as a form of control and governance in relation to both young people, those we call children, and older people, those we call adults, especially from disempowered groups. So that was one key motivation. Another one was to empirically, and I know this is a key motivation of socio-legal research, empirically to bring to light legal arenas that haven't been studied before. There are several of those that are unearthed in the book. I'll just mention one key one, perhaps, and that's the Israeli military courts. Now, as lawyers, when we hear the phrase military law, we often tend to think about something. We imagine something that's at the periphery of the legal system, but actually in the Israeli-Palestinian context, and not only in that context, it's a huge part of the legal system. And I explain that in the book. That's one of the legal sites, and I show how up to half of people imprisoned by Israel in any given year recently have been prosecuted and convicted by military courts, or Palestinians convicted by military courts. And this is actually the first academic book ever to analyze systematically Israeli military judgments, hundreds of military judgments, which were also very difficult to obtain because many of them are not publicly available. So that required a lot of archival work and years of just attempts to get access to those materials. So there was conceptual motivation, kind of an empirical motivation, and also that a theoretical motivation of trying to bring into dialogue fields of knowledge that so far haven't really been in conversation. So I'm thinking about childhood studies, which I alluded to earlier, as well as critical legal theory, not just critical legal studies, but critical legal theory more broadly, critical scholarship on human rights. There are many conversations being had where people aren't aware of work being done in other contexts. And I wanted to kind of connect those different dots. So that was part of the motivation.
Yes, and you mentioned there a couple of the really, I think, original contributions that this research is making. Not only these synergies between those different areas that aren't always in dialogue with one another, but I think, as you were discussing there, the work in relation to the military courts. And it's so striking that this information isn't readily available, and yet it affects such large numbers of people. So I think that's a really important contribution that your research is making there. And I just wonder what your experience of conducting the research and trying to get access to that must have been quite a frustrating process. So I just wondered if you could say something about that, and then also producing the book in the end, and your experience of that.
If I think of the experience, I think, first of all, I would say that it's been an intellectual journey, because I didn't really start at a point where I myself thought about childhood, human rights, and law as I do now. So a lot has happened. I didn't start thinking about Israel, Palestine as I think about it now. So I think I contextualize it a bit differently now. And obviously, as you mentioned, there was a journey there also in terms of the empirical work, getting access to those materials. I mentioned specifically the hundreds of military judgments that I analyzed, but obviously there are many other materials, both legal and human rights materials, but also because the book conceptualizes law very broadly, also media sources, cultural sources, all of which are intertwined with what law is and are often part of what law is. So that was part of the empirical journey. There was a journey there. It took me several years getting access from the Israeli military. Each time I got access to a new bunch of materials. When I did get access to the military materials, I was constantly surveilled by soldiers who seemed to be quite baffled by why anyone would be interested in these materials, because obviously no one previously did research them in that way. So they initially thought I was an NGO worker or something. And I think the reason why maybe part of the reason why I was able to gain access is, first of all, the fact that I'm Israeli, I'm Jewish. I served in the military when I was younger. I have a certain political capital. I know people who are quite well connected within the upper echelons of both the Israeli military and the Israeli legal system. So I have a lot of, again, symbolic capital that I could draw on, not always consciously, but in retrospect, I realized that that was crucial for gaining access to those materials. And I think the other reason why they gave me access is that initially this project was more of a sociology of kind of a socio-legal or a sociology of childhood project that wasn't as critical of the complicity of law and human rights in state violence and the way in which both the state and some of its critics end up harming disempowered people through legal and human rights means. So all of that didn't exist in some of the earlier versions of the project just because I hadn't reached that stage intellectually. So it was very authentic. When they asked me to submit a research proposal, the military did, in order to decide whether they would give me access, I think when they read it, it seemed pretty harmless, perhaps. And I think what happened during all those years of thinking about this project and working on it until publishing the book was that I veered into different directions that informed my thinking about this topic. I wrote about state violence in other contexts. I wrote about it in relation to torture by the US, by the UK, by Syria. I wrote on childhood in other contexts, which again have to do with other countries in other contexts, especially youth justice. And I think all of that combined informed my thinking and fed into some of the arguments in the book. So that was, I would say, part of the experience. There was a lot that went into the final outcome in the form of the book.
It's really interesting to hear about that journey from what you originally were intending on investigating, and then the conclusions as they evolved. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about, in terms of the arguments that you're making in the book, because I think some of the arguments are probably quite controversial, probably quite politically controversial, and maybe it's too early to tell how the book has been received, but do you have sort of certain expectations about how these arguments would be received, what sort of reception they might get in different quarters, and how controversial the arguments that you're making are likely to be seen as?
Yes, certainly. I think the arguments are in various ways controversial, and not necessarily in the ways people would expect if they just think about the topic. I think often debates about children are about whether their rights are being violated or not. So in the Israeli-Palestinian context, critics of Israel accuse it of just flouting international law and children's rights. And the discussion is often framed as if there are two sides to the arguments. Either Israel violates children's rights, which is bad, or it enforces them, and that would be good. And the book actually says that it shows in various ways how Israel, and I think that can be seen as a case study, because I don't think Israel is unique. It's representative of a broader complicity of, or a broader entanglement of childhood, human rights, and law in state violence in various ways. And the book demonstrates how, in various forms, Israel has increasingly harnessed the language and mechanisms of children's rights, human rights, and law to shape and legitimize its control over Palestinians. So that's a different argument to the one, it's a different criticism to the one you normally hear in the media. It's not a criticism of Israel framed as an allegation that Israel just ignores the law and ignores human rights or violates norms about the best interests of the child. It's a different argument. Equally, the book also challenges some of our tropes as a society, in our contemporary society, in relation to children. For example, the accusation that children are being robbed of their childhood, which is something that you see a lot in human rights reports on Palestinian children, but we're familiar with that trope in, I think, virtually any context relating to children. Almost all children are said to, in one form or another, being robbed of their childhood. There's nothing more inherent to the modern construction of childhood. And actually what the book argues is that, first of all, that narrative is essentialist. It essentializes childhood. It assumes a certain childhood which has a certain essence, and it's not sensitive to the particular context, which is one in which the state actually imposes on Palestinians a legally enshrined childhood, which works to their detriment. So the problem here is not that childhood disappears, but rather that childhood, a legalized version of childhood, is being used as a form of governance. So I think the reason why the arguments are controversial is because hopefully they reframe the way we think about some of the problems. Now, add to all of that the fact that some of the contribution of the book is empirical. So once you unearth many legal sources that have never been publicly available, what some of the findings of the book, what they do is challenge some of our factual assumptions about what's happening. And actually, the book shows how not only claims by the state, but also claims by the human rights community are often factually inaccurate, not necessarily maliciously, but factually inaccurate, and that has both practical and theoretical implications from a socio-legal perspective. So hopefully the book is controversial, but in a good way, in a way that challenges us to kind of think rigorously about some of our preconceptions about the role of the law, of human rights, and of childhood.
Yes, and certainly I think the book's important on different levels, as you've mentioned there, and also very critically questioning human concepts, basic concepts of human rights and law. I think there are so many different dimensions to the book that we could pick up on. So that's just been a sort of very sort of general discussion of the book, but because it's so rich and lots of different areas. But probably we don't really have time to go into it in its full depth just now. So perhaps just one final question, and that is to ask what sort of lessons as a socio-legal researcher you've learned conducting this type of research, and whether you have any sort of thoughts and advice for early career researchers who might want to conduct similar research.
It's a good question. I think in a sense, because we live in an increasingly neoliberal higher education landscape, I don't know if my experience is the one that people would be advised to follow, to take 14 years to write a book and to go for a topic that requires a lot of heavy lifting empirically and theoretically. So it's a lot of effort, both intellectually and otherwise. So I would say that probably the advice I would give depends on the project, depends on the person, and depends on what they're trying to achieve. So I'll just speak to my own experience. I think from my experience, if you're trying to produce a project that you find ambitious, both conceptually and empirically, what I've found in retrospect that I've benefited from is to try to publish several articles before publishing the book. In retrospect, I'm happy that I did that, because I think had I published the book straight after completing the PhD, that might work for other projects. It may well do, but I think because of the nature of this project, I'm happy that I took some time, because as I mentioned, there was a journey there in the process, and I think that allowed me to gain new insight that I didn't have previously, and quite an important insight, as well as contextualize the materials that I examine within broader contexts in relation to other countries, other times, and other theoretical frameworks. So for a similar project, I think I would advise, especially for people feeling a pressure to produce publications, I feel like shorter pieces is a good way to develop some of your ideas and put them out there, especially if you want to put your ideas out there, if you feel like they're very topical. Obviously, you shouldn't withhold your work, but I feel like that's a way in which you can see this as a journey rather than as something that needs to be out in the world immediately in a book form. But again, that is advice that I don't think is applicable to all projects or to all people in all circumstances. And sometimes it's something that people can't afford to do. In which case, I guess they would need to tailor the book slightly differently to accommodate a tighter time frame. So I guess the advice I'm giving is a combination of both practicality and realizing the constraints under which we're operating as scholars, as well as still wanting to pursue what academia is supposed to be all about, which is really an intellectual journey, and not rushing ideas where they're not fully, if I can use a word from the world of childhood studies, not fully mature, perhaps. Yeah, that's some preliminary thoughts.
Yes, that's really useful, and that gives us a lot to think about, I think. And I think those are very important ideas that probably we often forget in the rush to produce the research sometimes. So I think it's really important to think about these things. Well, I'm very grateful for you to taking the time to discuss your book with us. It was a very interesting read. I really enjoyed engaging with some of these ideas, and it was sort of aspects of different dimensions of this issue that I hadn't sort of thought about in that way before. So that made it very enjoyable. So thank you very much for speaking to us. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, and thank you to SLSA for the award. Thank you very much.